There are certain scientists whose reputation just sets them apart from all others. Not only because they've done groundbreaking work and published field-changing papers for decades, but because they've stepped out of their own fields and shared their passions with the public, trusting in the fact that even people who have no technical understanding of their research will still share their excitement and love for the ideas they work on and for the people they work with. The late Dr. Oliver Sacks was one of those extraordinary scientists. In fact, if you asked most people who don't know anything about neuroscience to name one famous neuroscientist, Sacks is probably the one they'd name. He might be the only one they could name. So many of us in the neuroscience field and out of it grew up loving his books, like Awakenings, Musicophilia, and my personal favorite, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. We all watched interviews and lectures with Dr. Sacks where he told us fascinating stories about his patients, like the man who lost his ability to recognize his loved ones, and the woman who hallucinated vivid scenes even though she was blind, and the man who had no memory and lived in 30-second slices of time. That's why when I had the chance to interview Dr. Sacks back in 2012, I practically jumped out of my chair, at the opportunity. His press agent emphasized that we'd be talking mostly about his most recent book, Hallucinations, which would turn out to be the last scientific book he ever published before he passed away in 2015 at the age of 82. But still, I couldn't resist the opportunity to ask Dr. Sacks about some of my deepest neuroscience questions, like what's the difference between hallucination and reality? Or between dreaming and being awake? Where are the boundaries between the internal and external worlds? And why do they sometimes break down? That podcast that came out of that interview was one of my all-time favorites that I ever did in terms of content. But we produced it back in the days when we were still learning what we were doing. I had no podcast experience, really, and a lot of the things on it were pretty sloppy, frankly, and that's as my fault as much as anyone's. And so that episode, like a lot of our oldest episodes, hasn't been available online for years. But a few months back, I put out feelers about it on Twitter. Hey, would anyone be interested in a re-release of the Oliver Sacks episode? And a lot of you said, yes, please re-release it. So we've remastered it, brought it up to the current standards of the Connectome podcast. And I'm excited to share with you today this brand new version of episode 8 of the Connectome podcast. The version that the late Dr. Oliver Sacks really deserves. Dr. Oliver Sacks, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Connectome podcast. Your latest book, Hallucinations, is all about the brain's visual system, how it works, and how it can do some very strange things when it goes wrong. And a lot of your work throughout your career has been focused on visual problems, visual hallucinations. Where did your interest in the visual side of life begin? What sparked it?
Well, color photography and stereo photography, all odd forms of photography, really occupied me between about 10 and 14. And there it was the processes. That was my entry into neurophysiology and sort of three-color vision.
Yeah, in your books, you talk a lot about your childhood interest in photography, especially in the book Uncle Tungsten, which is sort of autobiographical. You tell a lot of stories in that book about your childhood experiments in all kinds of scientific fields. But you especially talk about your passion for taking photos and developing the film yourself. And it sounds like you were an avid photographer at heart, long before you were a neuroscientist.
Yeah, I was, and strangely, a lot of my interest in the visual came, I think, from photography. And then when I was in California, I had a motorbike then. I used to go to the Grand Canyon and all over with quite a big camera. I had a 4x5 Linhof, and I sort of worshipped Ansel Adams and half wanted to be a landscape photographer.
Yeah, and it was on those trips, you say in the book Hallucinations, that you discovered another of your great lifelong fascinations, psychedelic drugs. And I find it really interesting, not strange, really, but interesting, that almost every neuroscientist I talk to has experimented with psychedelic substances at some point in their life. And your psychedelic substance of choice at that time, you say in the book, was mescaline.
Well, I think I was interested in hallucinations before that. Well, as I mentioned, I think in the book I was reading Weir Mitchell's, turn of the century, the 19th century papers on mescaline and so forth when I was 18 years old, but I didn't actually try anything until I was 30. But I can't pretend that I took the drugs for entirely educational purposes.
Well, of course not. And I mean, like your interest in photography and your interest in the visual system and hallucinations started from something recreational, something fun. It's very natural, I think, that the things we find most fun are the things we want to investigate and understand. But at the same time, not all hallucinatory experiences are so fun or meaningful. And you talk about some of those less meaningful experiences in this book, experiences where the patient is hallucinating something, wildly random musical notation, for example, and feels no emotional connection to it at all. There's nothing, Jungian about it. There's no deep subconscious symbolism in these hallucinations. It's just wild, semi-random misfiring in the brain's visual system. So is there any commonality there? Anything that's common to all hallucinations, random or not?
Yes, there's, I think with all hallucinations or many hallucinations, there's a feeling of astonishment. If you imagine things, you know that you have imagined it. But with a hallucination, you feel who ordered that? Where did it come from? And this applies to the hallucinations of musical notation as well. And at first, these hallucinations look real and plausible, as if one could play it or sing it. They have staves and clefs and key signatures and bars, but when one really looks at them, one finds they're completely unplayable, unsingable, that they don't make sense. And then there's a huge superabundance of all sorts of things for appoggiatures and acciatures and phrase marks and so forth, which in fact make it sort of nonsense. I've had one patient who's tried particularly hard to transcribe some of his hallucinatory music. I was hoping he might do so and that I might put it in the paper. He will put up a newspaper on his music stand and stare a little bit, and then it will transform itself into music, and which he will try to play. But then typically the thing alters in 3 seconds and turns into different music, and it keeps altering.
So there's definitely that feeling of astonishment, of wondering, like you say, who ordered that? Because even though it's a really elaborate hallucination, there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. It makes no sense. It holds no emotional significance. But do you think there's a reason why some people and not others hallucinate specific types of things? For example, I don't think I could hallucinate musical notation because I don't know it. I might hallucinate maybe pages of printed words.
printed matter and music are both things one has to learn, and there seem to be areas of the brain which have evolved for other purposes but can be redeployed for reading print or reading music. With the studies that have been done of people reading musical scores, not hallucinations, and when they do that, usually the print part of the brain is not stimulated, but other parts of the brain. But there could certainly be some overlap, and I think some people may hallucinate both.
So even though musical notation engages different parts of the brain than printed words do, a misfiring in a person's visual system might summon up either one of those things or something completely different. And it sounds like it's all but impossible in many cases to predict specifically what any given person will hallucinate. But even though these hallucinations hold no emotional significance for the people who experience them, are those people ever able to extract any meaning out of them? In other words, could these hallucinations be, for lack of a better word, translated, the way we can sometimes translate the seemingly random ideas that our imaginations come up with into a coherent story?
Well, I think normally when one imagines music or reads real music, it is suffused with emotion and association, as when one reads a book. But this may not be so with the hallucinations. On the whole, these hallucinations of musical notation and also most lexical hallucinations are partly nonsensical and arouse no special feeling except surprise and perhaps amusement, perhaps annoyance. But here, one is has, instead of the usual chain going from primary sensory cortex up to prefrontal cortex, there's just a little bit in the middle, in infotemporal cortex or parietal or whatever, which has taken on an autonomous life of its own, not informed by reality and also not informed by memory or emotion. And so it's very, very different from imagination.
So that's one major factor that separates hallucination from imagination. It's not deliberate. The person has no control over it. And so you can't really draw clear links to memory or emotion. And in that sense, these kinds of hallucinations really are just random misfirings of the brain's visual system. It reminds me of a story you tell in this book, Hallucinations, about the woman who kept hallucinating the face of Kermit the Frog for no apparent reason. And sometimes Kermit looked happy, and other times he looked angry. And this was totally confusing to this woman, understandably. And she was saying, Kermit the Frog means nothing to me. Why does he keep appearing to me in all these different forms? And in your book, you talk a lot about Charles Bonnet syndrome, the condition that actually a lot of blind people experience. A surprisingly large number of blind people hallucinate apparently random imagery because their visual cortex isn't getting any stimulation from the outside world. So it takes whatever random electrical signals it gets and interprets them as visual perceptions, which are often totally bizarre. Is this woman who hallucinated Kermit the Frog one of those Charles Bonnet syndrome cases, or was there a different mechanism behind her hallucinations?
Well, with the woman who saw Kermit the Frog and said Kermit means nothing to me, she had a lesion in her occipital cortex on one side, and Kermit was only in half the visual field, but one can call that a sort of Charles Bonnet syndrome as well. One would like to think that everything must be determined at some level, but it's not easy to obviously, if she'd never seen Kermit the Frog, she couldn't have hallucinated him. One can't avoid a feeling that there may also be some anarchic or random elements, but this is a difficult thing to answer. Incidentally, as I mentioned in the book, when Charles Lulaire's entire 18-page dictation came to light, soon after the interpretation of dreams was published, people imagined that these hallucinations would be a royal road to the unconscious and understanding the person, but they didn't get anywhere.
So unlike dreams, which psychologists have treated as windows into the unconscious for, a century or more, these kinds of hallucinations don't really give us a peek behind the curtain. They don't really tell you anything about a person's mind, except that this is how it interprets these random neural misfirings. But is that true of all hallucinations? Are there other types of hallucinations? For example, temporal lobe hallucinations, which can include sounds and feelings and often have a spiritual or religious significance. A lot of people with temporal lobe epilepsy, have become spiritual mystics. So could these kinds of hallucinations give us a clearer window into the workings of those deep parts of our minds?
Not with this sort of hallucination. There may be with some of the temporal lobe hallucinations, which are multimodal and very much informed by memory and feeling.
Right. Temporal lobe hallucinations have even been known to make religious converts out of the people who experience them. There have actually been studies, as you know, on people who are strongly religious or hyper-religious who say they experience visions of the divine. And it's been shown that a lot of them do experience temporal lobe epileptic seizures. And when you combine these intense sights and sounds and intense emotions, I can easily imagine that it'd leave you with a strong conviction of the reality of that experience.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. That's the sort of Dostoevsky type.
So temporal lobe hallucinations include strong connections with emotion and memory. They feel like they carry a deep significance to the point that they can literally make religious converts out of the people who experience them. So this raises an interesting question. What's the difference? What's happening in temporal lobe hallucinations that isn't happening in these random, meaningless Charles Bonnet-style hallucinations like musical notation or Kermit the Frog's face? What's the difference?
Well, the temporal lobes are sort of close to the amygdala and hippocampus, as to say, to memory and feeling. And perhaps this sort of anatomical contiguity goes with a sort of functional contiguity. For example, Gowers in the 19th century described an epileptic seizure in which the person felt that everything was wrong, i.e. morally wrong, and then he might have a convulsion or he might not. But there is no sense of wrong or right or morality associated with the Charles Bonnet ones. I think basically because they're coming from early in the visual pathway and they don't anatomically, they don't spread as far as the amygdala and hippocampus.
So it could be as simple as an anatomical functional difference. For one reason or another, these meaningless hallucinations like random musical notation or Kermit the Frog just don't spread beyond the brain's visual system. They don't reach areas like the amygdala, right, which is involved in fear and disgust, or the hippocampus, which is helping form and retrieve memories. So memory and emotion just don't get looped in neurologically. All this talk about emotional hallucinations makes me think about other symptoms and behaviors that we see in a lot of people with temporal lobe seizures, like echolalia, for example, where they compulsively repeat words they hear, or glossolalia, sometimes called speaking in tongues, where they rattle off these incredible strings of syllables that nobody can understand. And I wonder, since people can hallucinate musical notes, has there ever been a case of musicolalia, where a person had a seizure or a hallucination and started compulsively singing or playing music?
Yes, well, I had a big, like 50 pages on musical hallucinations in my book Musicophilia. And unlike the Charles Bonnet hallucinations, musical hallucinations are almost always of familiar music, music especially which was in the culture as one was growing up, whether it was in church or on the radio or whatever. Music which may be very moving and significant for one, but also which may be hateful. One of my patients who had grown up as a little Jewish boy in the 30s hallucinated Nazi marching songs.
So when these people hallucinated these familiar songs, were the songs exactly as they remembered them, or were the lyrics or melodies changed in some way?
Well, the ordinary songs and perhaps the lyrics were not changed. But now, some people, it was said, but it seems to be a myth, that, say, Shostakovich got wounded in the war and had a shell splinter in his brain, and that this tickled parts of the temporal lobe and gave him a sort of fountain of music, which he then exploited to compose. But that's a favorite myth, which I think isn't true. But some people may be assisted by hallucinations to write real music. As Virginia Adair, the poet, used her Charles Bonnet hallucinations.
So in some cases, people can actually draw on their hallucinations or on their symptoms of echolalia and glossolalia to create art.
You put echolalia and glossolalia together. I don't know that they come together. Echolalia is something which one can see sometimes in people with Tourette's syndrome, sometimes in people with autism, people with frontal lobe damage. It's an automatic repetition. Sometimes there is an echophonia, which is just an imitation of noises, of dogs barking and traffic and this and that, whereas glossolalia is an uttering of, as it were, of inspired nonsense, which one is likely to have in a Baptist church or in some hot religious circumstances.
So we might say that echolalia, the compulsive repeating of random words, is just a symptom of random brain misfirings, like some of these meaningless hallucinations are, where glossolalia, on the other hand, rattling off these long strings of, as you say, inspired nonsense syllables, does carry an emotional significance, a spiritual significance even. It's something ecstatic. And that makes me wonder, could it be that when the conscious mind, the analytical parts of the brain, like the prefrontal cortex, are preoccupied with this state, with speaking these ecstatic syllables, could it be that that actually frees up other brain areas to communicate more than they normally would? Just as we know from fMRI studies that meditation can make distant brain areas much more connected and communicative than they'd normally be. Could that kind of hyperconnectivity also be involved in the spiritual visions that these people have in these ecstatic states? For example, when they meditate, in a church service on the face of Jesus or the face of the Virgin Mary, and they claim that they can literally see it appearing to them. Could that be because being in this ecstatic state frees up other areas of their brain to communicate more than they normally would?
I say a certain amount in the book about how some evangelicals cultivate, their prayer consists partly of cultivating very vivid, concrete images of Jesus. What did he look like? Which direction was he facing? How was he dressed? And so forth. But after a while, these may pass over into hallucinations. But I can't connect this in a direct way with glossolalia.
So maybe it's not so much about the glossolalia per se, so much as it's just about fixating one's attention on a specific idea or image. So it keeps feeling realer and realer until, in some cases, a person literally can see the image they're fixating on. It crosses over from the world of abstract thought into the concrete world of visual perception.
Yeah. And, if it crosses over, this may then seem to sort of confirm, because suddenly it is no longer a product of your imagination. It is there. It has come from the great elsewhere or wherever.
Right. The vision, exactly. It doesn't feel like it's coming from inside your own mind at all. It's there as part of your sensory experience of the world, so it seems to be coming from outside of you. Maybe from outside the material world altogether. And we were talking a few minutes ago about how real a temporal lobe hallucination can feel compared to the semi-random Charles Bonnet type of hallucination, which people usually recognize as a hallucination right away. Could it be that in these kinds of self-induced religious visions, people are actually triggering something like a small seizure in their own brains?
Well, certainly, usually Charles Bonnet hallucinations are recognized as hallucinations and don't engender delusions unless the person is becoming demented as well. But certainly, one is much more likely to have formation of delusions with the ecstatic hallucinations, and one is motivated. One wants the heavens to open, God to appear.
So in some cases, if we want something to exist badly enough, it actually can pop out of our abstract thoughts and into our sensory experience of the world. It's extraordinary, isn't it, to think that we're able to shape our own perceptions of reality so much just by wanting it badly. And I think a lot of other cultures understand this, have understood it for a very long time, especially when you combine that will to believe with an ecstatic ritual, and in a lot of cases also with psychedelic drugs. The beliefs of the tribe, of the group, can translate into actual shared sensory experiences.
But this will also depend very much on culture and circumstances. I hadn't really touched about hallucinations in other cultures, but certainly hallucinogens have been used and discovered by every culture and used in religious rituals. It may be much easier to hallucinate if there are some like-minded people around and there's a ritual.
Right, exactly. Power in numbers. If everyone else in the ritual is saying they see the gods, and you're worked up into an ecstatic state, and you're on hallucinogenic drugs, it becomes much easier for you to see the gods too. And this is actually something I've read in a lot of reports, not just of people's psychedelic experiences, but also in reports of temporal lobe epileptic hallucinations. People tend to hallucinate in the iconographic language, so to speak, that they're most familiar with. If you're Catholic, you'll see the Virgin Mary. If you're Hindu, you'll see Shiva and Vishnu.
In my drug days, I try to see God myself, but I'm such so skeptical and so stubbornly atheistic, it never worked.
So maybe if you're an atheist, then you hallucinate nothing. It actually kind of makes sense. And what about schizophrenic hallucinations and delusions, which also tend to include these feelings of divine purpose and epic greatness? Could those be connected here too?
I steered clear of the subject of schizophrenic hallucinations, which are nearly always associated with delusions and states of mind, but that really needs quite separate. It needs a book of its own.
Oh, I'm sure it does. There's so much emotional complexity in schizophrenic delusions and hallucinations. And there's also another type of hallucination that you talk about in your book, a type that's always been eerily fascinating to me personally, and that's hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations, which almost all of us experience as we're sliding into and out of sleep. And in that section of the book, you talk about the original folk tale of the nightmare, or the nightmare, which is not a bad dream at all, but a mythological demon in the form of a horse that brings on what we today would call sleep paralysis, that crushing feeling on one's chest, an inability to move, and an overpowering sense of dread of an evil presence in the room. I've experienced this myself throughout my whole life, and it's terrifying every time. And according to your book, almost everyone has experienced it at some point in their life. Now, could that kind of panic also be linked to hyperconnectivity in the brain, or maybe the shutdown of certain brain areas as we're falling asleep or trying to wake up?
The sleep paralysis and the feeling of an ominous presence or someone sitting on you. Well, they used to say it was from lying on one's back. Well, certainly some people have this from an early age. I don't really have a hypothesis there. I don't think it can be connected up with personality. I think it's a neurological thing of sorts, and very unpleasant, very, very unpleasant.
Well, as we're falling asleep, our brains and our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous systems have to coordinate this really complex dance, this elaborate series of neurological handoffs and shutdowns.
Yeah, and there are all sorts of dissociations between them and sort of waking dreams, so-called lucid dreams.
And those dissociations don't always go as planned, which is why we get things like sleep paralysis, the nightmare, and hypnagogic and hypnopompic hallucinations. And like hallucinations, dreams also come in different flavors, you might say. We can have lucid dreams where we're aware that we're dreaming, and we can even have some control over those dreams. And then there are the more ordinary garden variety dreams where you don't know if you're dreaming or not. They're just kind of happening to you. And that makes me wonder, is there a significant link between hallucinations and dreams? Are they the same thing, or are they just similar?
Well, one could say, in a sense, that dreams are like hallucinations and that they come to you, but they're quite unlike hallucinations in that there's no other mode of consciousness present. People are sort of embedded and absorbed in their dreams, whereas you can be having dinner and a hallucination appears in the corner of the room. I asked my first patient when she described Charles Bonnet hallucinations, I said, are they like dreams? And she said, not at all. She said, they're like film strips, bits of silent movie, although I think some of the temporal lobe ones are like dreams, and when they were first described by Hewlings-Jackson, he spoke of dreamy states. And as for perception, and hallucinations use the pathways which perceptions do, and they are projected out into the world, and that's why they seem so real.
And actually, in one of the cases you describe in this book, the case of the patient you call Ted R., you say he didn't describe his hallucinations as hallucinations at all. He described them as illusions because they weren't completely novel images. They were just distortions and transformations of the world he was already seeing.
Yes, I think that's probably a useful distinction, although that can blur as well.
So with all these things, hallucinations, delusions, illusions, dreams, it sounds like we're almost talking about a gradient here. At one end of the gradient, we have our ordinary perceptions of the world, the sort of things that everyone can agree is real. And then at the opposite end, we have, maybe a non-lucid dream, a dream where there's no control, or a severe schizophrenic hallucination, where the person is completely immersed in their own alternate reality.
Well, I'm not sure that I would go with the notion of gradients. I mean, some of these states may have, as it were, doors or portals into other things, but the otherness is there. Hypnagogic imagery is distinct from dreaming, although one might move from one into the other.
So maybe it's not so much a gradient as a series of distinct states of consciousness. And it can be surprisingly easy for our minds to shift from one of those states into another. And in some of those states, dreams, for example, our subjective experience of the world feels completely qualitatively different from ordinary life. Emotions are much stronger. Time and space are shifting wildly. As soon as you think of a certain person, they appear right in front of you. And memory also seems to be fragmented in those states. It's hard to form clear memories of your dreams, right? A lot of mornings, we can barely remember them at all. Whereas with some of these hallucinations, the meaningless Charles Bonnet ones especially, you're starting from the base of an ordinary state of waking consciousness and sort of superimposing something else onto that. And nothing about your conscious experience changes qualitatively, except that now you're hallucinating something.
And people may have very clear memories of hallucinations, even if it was something which occurred with a fever when they were 6 years old, whereas dream memory is notoriously unstable.
And might there be even other states of consciousness besides the ones we've been talking about? States that all of us maybe have experienced and not noticed, or others that certain people experience at certain times under specific conditions. You know, it's fascinating, isn't it, to think that there might be a whole library, so to speak, of states of consciousness that our brains have the potential to access.
Well, William James wrote about this after having a nitrous oxide experience, and he said this showed him that there were many, many sorts of consciousness separated by the thinnest of films, and certainly there were many forms beside rational consciousness. That, the big question in neurology and neuroscience is the basis of consciousness or different forms of consciousness, and we are still very ignorant, although these vast brain projects, Connectome and so forth, may get us rather closer.
And that gets at one of my deepest, greatest neuroscience questions. What is it exactly that distinguishes waking consciousness from dreaming consciousness? How do we know whether we're, as the philosopher Zhuangzi said, a man dreaming he's a butterfly or a butterfly dreaming he's a man? This sounds like a very abstract philosophical question, but brain scans are advancing to the point now where we might actually be able to start looking for the precise neural correlates of being awake versus being in a dream.
This is a question we all ask, and some people feel that we may never get an answer, but who knows?
And that, my friends, was the last I ever heard from Dr. Oliver Sacks. Just a few weeks after we made that recording, he announced that he'd been diagnosed with terminal cancer. And soon after, he began his very well-deserved rest and retreat from public life. I was never able to get another interview with him. But after that discussion, I was left with so many questions, and with the nagging feeling that Dr. Sacks had more answers, or at least ideas of answers, than he was letting on. After all, here was a man who'd spent the last 50 years studying hallucinations and altered states of consciousness, a man who'd been experimenting with mescaline and other mind-altering drugs since he was a young man. I felt he must have some of his own ideas about this spectrum of consciousness we've been talking about, and about where we might find some of the other signposts along it. But I never found out. At the end of the day, I was a young, unknown neuroscience reporter, and he was one of the world's most famous neuroscientists. And looking back, he may well have been diagnosed with terminal cancer just days before he talked with me. In view of all that, I was extremely lucky to get a half hour of his full attention, and I still feel honored by it today. But I never gave up my search for answers to those burning questions I asked. What is it that distinguishes waking consciousness from dreaming consciousness? Where are the signposts along that spectrum? In fact, I was thrilled to delve into those exact questions in detail almost 4 years later with Dr. Robin Carhart Harris on episode 16 of the Connectome podcast. Along the way, I had opportunities to talk with a lot of other great researchers in the field, Nobel Prize laureates, groundbreaking theorists, and even some other neuroscientific public figures on their way to fame. And over the next few months, I'm going to be remastering and re-releasing more of those podcasts. And I think those of you who haven't heard them are just going to love them. So keep an eye out for that. Until then, have a great week, everybody. Go do some science!
wrist. Woo! I kept it snowing through the blitz. God, cross promoting in the fashion world. Shit, I got Adidas selling bricks. Roll to the rich flow, popping like Crisco. We was buying Macklemore, cooked it in the Klitschko. Counterclockwise, my wrist go. Counterclockwise, my wrist go.
Hey, and back that boy, they back to down the day. Over that girl, they back to down the day. We fuck her till it's good, good. I got my customers in